Dr. Kerry Bennett, and ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Just to tell you a little bit about Point Cook and its history and the Bristol Boxkites at Point Cook. If I start by going back to yesterday, which was the 1st of March, obviously, then 102 years. 102 years ago from yesterday. Is that sounding all right?
Yes.
102 years ago from yesterday, we had the very first military flight at Point Cook, and that occurred in the Bristol Boxkite. And there are a number of events that were going on back in that early period that led up to that first flight, and I'll just go through a few of those. In 1903, you had the Wright brothers performing their very famous first powered flight in their Wright Flyer. In 1909, you had the Frenchman Blériot flying across the English Channel, and the very first crossing of the English Channel. And then the very first flight in England by Samuel Cody in his Cody aeroplane. Now, there are a number of people in Australia all involved in aviation, and probably not much is known about that unless you do a lot of reading. But in 1910 we had George Taylor, who made the very first glider flight near Narrabeen near Sydney. Then we had Eric Weiss, whom you would know as Harry Houdini, doing his very first powered flight in Australia near Diggers Rest, not far from here. Then you had John Dugan, an Australian, and he flew the very first Australian-built powered aeroplane. And he went on later to serve in the Australian Flying Corps during World War I. Now, while all these events were going on in England and Australia, there was a chap in England who, where are we? There we go. In England, and his name was Sir George White, chap there, and he was very famous for aeroplanes in England. And a little bit about his history is he was born in Bristol in 1854, the son of a house painter and a lady's maid. He became the city's greatest late Victorian entrepreneur. He built a reputation as a company doctor, which is interesting. He used to buy failing businesses and turn them around. Very smart thinking. But his particular enthusiasm was in transport. And by the turn of the century, he'd built a considerable empire in tramways and railways, but his baronetcy in 1904 was due as much to his philanthropy as to his financial achievements. He founded the Bristol Aeroplane Company he thought about aircraft, and he turned his interest to that and manufacturing aeroplanes, selling them to the public and to government organisations. He founded the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company early in 1910. The Boxkite, as we can see over there, is the very first aeroplane that he built, and that flew on the 31st of July 1910. His company was the first forming a production line for the building of aeroplanes. In late 1910, he sent a number of sales missions overseas to advertise his wares. He sent sales missions to India, to Russia, and also to Australia. And so in late December 1910, the first mission arrived in Perth, and there were two crated Bristol Boxkites. They assembled one, flew it around Perth, and then the mission came across to Melbourne. And guess where they flew that aeroplane? That was down Altona Bay, as it was known then. And that was in February 1911. And then the next lot of flights were all done up in Sydney at Mascot, and at Mascot that was the very first flight ever undertaken at Mascot by Bristol Boxkite. And of course Mascot's a big airport now. All these flights were reported on by the Army representatives, of course, and going back to the factory, there are a total of only 76 Boxkites ever built. 21 of them were a standard Boxkite, and that means it had an equal wingspan. The military type Boxkites, of which they built 55, that had an extended wing out the top, which you'll see shortly. The Boxkite became the very first aeroplane to be exported from the United Kingdom. So it was quite a historic aircraft in that regard. Now, while all this was going on, again, the Department of Defence in Australia were looking at aeroplanes for their use in the military environment. And in 1912, our Department of Defence, they ordered one military type Boxkite. They also purchased 2 Deeper Doosan's and 5 B-2 aeroplanes. Now, that's the very first Boxkite down at Point Cook in around about that 1914 period. Very flimsy looking, but anyway, it did the job. And the Boxkite was only purchased as a very elementary trainer. And so you had an instructor and a student used to sit in the back seat, and he'd reach over the shoulder of the instructor to hold the control column, and the instructor would instruct him on how to fly an aeroplane, and they'd do a circuit in that way. And then when the instructor thought the student was good enough to take the aircraft on his own, he'd jump out, the student would sit in the front seat, and then away the student would go. And so with about maybe 5 hours of flying, you would have a student flying an aeroplane. Very basic in those days. Now, Lieutenant Eric Harrison and Captain Henry Petrie were selected as the flying instructors for that newly formed Central Flying School at Point Cook. Both of these chaps were test pilots at the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company, so they were well qualified for the job. Harrison performed that very first military flight at Point Cook at 0740 hours on Sunday the 1st of March in 1914. Now, being a Sunday, of course, the press wasn't out and about, so it never got known that that had actually happened. And it wasn't until Monday that the press found about it, and then the reports on that flight started to appear in the paper on the following Tuesday. And then there were a couple of weeks of records of what was happening down at Point Cook with the Army flying. Now there's another shot of the Boxkite just out and about, and you can see how flimsy they are. Next one you'll see Harrison. He's flying Brigadier General Gordon, who was the Chief of the Army at the time. He decided to come out to Point Cook to see what was happening, and he said, I want to go for a flight. So Harrison got taken for a flight. It was a very windy day that day in particular, but nonetheless they went for a flight. Now you can see the Brigadier General's all dressed in his good civvy outfit. Harrison is dressed in his coat and hat on back to front, because at that time there was no uniforms for flying people at that time. So that's the way they used to go flying. And interestingly enough, that's what happened in about the next 4 and 5 months with flying at Point Cook until the very first course of students started on the 17th of August in 1914. And there were only 4 students on that course. 2 weeks earlier, there was the outbreak of World War I. So we were just in time to start getting people ready for World War I. Now, coming to the present time, I could go on and on a bit about Point Cook in that time, but we perhaps haven't got enough time, and Steve's more capable of talking about that than I am. Anyway, coming to the present time, about 12 years ago, I could see that the 100th anniversary of that 1st of March flight was coming up and that something needed to be done. And what better way to commemorate that event than to have a flying Boxkite available for the 1st of March 2014. So after discussing this with my colleague Jeff Matthews, we decided to proceed with the project, which became known as Project 2014, a Bristol military Boxkite for the RAAF Museum. And the aim of this project was to design and construct an airworthy, safe, reliable and easily maintained replica of a Bristol military Boxkite, and that's to be available to commemorate 100 years of military flying in Australia on the 1st of March 2014. Our initial budget was $70,000. And of course there was no defence money available for that, and so we sought sponsorship, and after writing to about 10 companies, begging companies to provide some money as begging letters go, 5 companies came on board, so we were able to get our money. Our initial planning was over a 2-year period, and we estimated there was about 4 to 5 years to build the aircraft. And so construction started, and we started cutting wood in April '06. And you can see from that slide there's many parts needed, of course, and that just shows you some of the struts fittings and socket fittings that are needed out of high tensile steel. And of course there's many more. That one just shows you some of the construction of the wing panels, and that's there with one of the ailerons fitted, and that gives you a bit of an insight into the internal structure of the aeroplane. There you see some fabric covering that has to go on the outside. The materials we used in the construction, all the wood is of spruce, and you'll see later the lower undercarriage area is a bit more solid, and that's made out of Queensland ash, mountain ash. The material you see there is a polyfibre, and you lay it on the surface with a poly tack, it's like a glue, and then you set an iron to a certain temperature, and that gives that shrinkage of the nylon to make it taut. And then you apply a poly brush, which in our case was a clear poly brush, which seals the web of the material, and then you apply an exterior coating of a polytone with a UV additive, which gives it a UV protection against the sun. There you see the elevator and the big foreplane out the front of the aeroplane, all in its finished condition, and all braced and ready to fit. This one shows you a typical joint where the wooden strut goes into the socket, and then you have all the different bracing wires of high tensile stainless steel wire attached to the socket fitting. And the bracing gives the whole aircraft its strength. There you see the propeller. It's made out of laminations of maple and Queensland ash, and that was made in a town called Lightning Ridge, just on the Queensland border. That particular guy has a contract with the engine manufacturer about making the propellers. Here you see the seats, and it's a fairly basic seat, but in compliance with current regulations it also has a seat belt. In those days, in 1914, aircraft didn't have seat belts, and in fact the seats were just sat in a wooden structure. They weren't really fixed to the aircraft, and that made them adjustable. So if any mishap, the pilot goes straight out the front. That's an arrangement of the seating, showing you the engine instruments and the airspeed indicator and the altimeter that It's fitted to the aircraft, and that's a requirement by current day safety standards, which has been unfortunate because it starts to add a bit of weight to the aeroplane. Now there you have the engine. The original engines were called a gnome rotary engine. In fact, the whole engine rotated. This is a stationary engine, and that old engine was a gnome rotary, a 50 horsepower engine. The engine we have is a modern stationary engine, and it's 110 horsepower. And it's made locally by a company called Rotec out of Moorabbin. They've shifted from Moorabbin, but they're still in Melbourne. And they make two types of engines, 110 horsepower engine, and this is a 7-cylinder. They make a 9-cylinder, 150 horsepower engine. And they sell a lot of these to overseas markets, particularly in the States. So it's a good business for this small company in Australia. They made the oil tank, which is the smaller one you see there, and the bigger one, which is the fuel tank. That's another view from the other side, and it just shows you the propeller installed. And the whole setup there is a module, and it just slides into the aircraft. There's just an arrangement of the engine sitting in the hangar, and it's getting ready to be fitted into the airframe. Now this is another joint, and that shows you where that's the centre section area out this way, and that particular joint, oops, I went too far. Oh, going too far, sorry, knocked that one up. These particular black areas here are where the outer wing panels join onto the aircraft. The original aircraft were built in one long length, whereas we made our wings detachable. So if ever the aircraft needed to be moved around, then it could be. That's typical of the undercarriage arrangement. There you have just a piece of bungee cord which forms a springing arrangement for the aircraft. That gives you your suspension and makes for a slightly smoother ride along the rough ground. And you can see from those early photographs down at Point Cook, the ground was particularly rough. So that's how it was. There you see himself doing some assembly work on the centre section, and the aircraft is gradually being assembled. Here you have it on display in 2010 at one of Point Cook's air pageants, and there was a lot of interest in it at that stage by people asking all sorts of questions. Now the little, the little piece you see here is interesting. That's the rudder of a B-2A. I mentioned the B-2A, of which we had two of, and that was the very start of another project which one of our volunteers undertook, and that was to build a Bristol a B-2A aircraft. And the B-2A aircraft was used as, well, supposed to be used as an advanced trainer. So once you did your elementary training, you got your wings, having learnt to fly, you then went on to the B-2A, and that was more advanced because it had instruments. You learned a bit of navigation, whereas the Bristol Boxkite at that time in 1914 had no instruments whatsoever. So it was very basic. Anyway, the guy built that, and it's now on display in the RAAF Museum. That's just another photo of it trundling back down to its hangar to have further assembly work. And there's yours truly with my friend and colleague Jeff Matthews standing out on the airfield. And just a different view from the rear end. Now, we had quite a number of visits from different people over the years, and there you have Air Marshal Binskin, who was Chief of our Air Force at the time, came down and he wanted to see the Boxkite, and he said, well, why'd you come and sit in it? So he did. And he enjoyed that, and he thought this was marvellous, and he said, keep going. and so we did. But he was very impressed with what we were doing. Now, the aircraft has that number CFS3, which is Central Flying School, aircraft number 3. When the aircraft first arrived at Point Cook and started flying with Harrison and Petrie, they weren't numbered. And they only got their number when they started the flying courses in August 14. And so the Boxkite had the number CSF3. And it was painted on the tail in that position. Now the central rudder, you'll see it's called the Bristol, and the constructors were the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company, Bristol, England, and you can see that it had constructors number 133. Now, it wasn't the 133rd Bristol Boxkite on the production line, it was just the 133rd aircraft on their production line, because they were building another number of other different types of aeroplanes along the way. So we thought, well, that'd be good to have that number on the tailplane, as well as CSF number 3. That's just another shot of it outside, and you can see a bit of the clearness of the clear coating that we put on the aeroplane. It shows all the ribs of the different areas of the aeroplane. That's just more assembly work going on, and we were starting to get the outer wing panels on. It looks a bit messy in the hangar against the hangar roof and the verticals of the hangars, but it all comes together. Now, that's an interesting shot. It shows you the wing extension on the wing, which gives the name the military Boxkite, and then the black struts to hold the outer wing panel up. Now, a military Boxkite was supposed to give you the capability of carrying a third person, and also you could carry an extra larger fuel tank to give you a longer range for more reconnaissance type work. We didn't have it in that configuration. We only ever had it in the configuration where it was an elementary trainer just for teaching students to fly. There's an interesting shot looking down what you'd say is a tunnel, and it shows you the symmetry of all the struts and the different bracing wires that go together to hold the aircraft together. There's some more assembly work, and then it was ready for its first engine runs. So after all the work we've done and seeing the engine run and work well and be tested outside, Jeff Matthews sitting in the rear seat there with our museum engine man. And there it is, ready for its certificate of airworthiness. And the certificate of airworthiness was issued by the Sports Aircraft Association of Australia, which is really a subsidiary of the CASA organisation, and that occurred on the 10th of July 1913. The registration is VHXK2, and it was in the experimental category. There you see it taxiing along on the test with the test pilot, and there you see on its very first flight, and that occurred on the 11th of September 13. Luckily enough, the wind died down enough late in the afternoon for us to get in the air, just on dusk. And that's the best shot we really have of it flying on its very first occasion. And there's a happy pair of engineers, myself and Jeff Matthews, and a very extremely happy test pilot. And that was Air Vice Marshal Mark Skidmore. He was a qualified test pilot, and he is now Director of Flying Safety with the CASA organisation. So on the 14th of March, we had the centenary military aviation, and the aircraft flew on both occasions on the 1st and 2nd of March 2014, and on the 1st of March it flew at 0740, and that's exactly 100 years to the day and the hour when Eric Harrison took to the air. So there we go. I think that's probably about all, as Kerry's giving me a bit of a nod there. And there you go. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions, then I'm quite happy to answer.
Thank you.
This is one of its circuit flights, and you'll see the aircraft is about to line up on the runway, and it'll head south down towards Port Phillip Bay. That runway you see there is the main Point Cook runway, and runs north and south. So what you see is really about what a student does here. Here he goes, taking off, about to get airborne. This was taken from a GoPro camera high up on the rear tail area. Looking forward, of course. That's the cross runway you see, and it's heading down to the bottom end of the base. And it's at the bottom end of the base where you see those hangars. That was the very first starting point of the aircraft being at Point Cook with their new hangars. And it all took place down in that area because we operated seaplanes down there as well. So it needed to be close to the ocean. Now where he is now is probably at about a height of 400 feet. If someone wants to convert that to metric, don't worry. And now he's turning down towards Geelong, so you're heading west. And you can see the bottom end of the base coming into view there. In fact, the aircraft really almost passes over the very first hangar where the aircraft was housed and maintained, which is still there. Now this is the sort of view I would suspect that Joseph Hammond, who flew from Altona, would have had on his trip to Geelong. He performed the very first cross-country trip in an aeroplane in Australia, and that was in 1911. Went down to Geelong one day and then returned the next day. And it took him probably about an hour and a half. About 40 knots, 40 miles an hour, I should say. So you're looking at about 60 kilometres an hour. So he's now turning north and starting to head up towards Mount Macedon. And you're at about 400 feet.
Notwithstanding the funny view there from the camera, there's no dihedral on that aircraft.
That's correct.
What's it like in the turn?
Very awkward. Yeah. And that's one of the complaints from our test pilots, which is another long story.
Ron, I noticed that the propeller is
behind the pilot.
Yeah,
That's correct.
which is very unusual.
Yes, it is. So now he's heading north, and that's sort of heading up towards the Mount Macedon type area. You won't get that far, of course.
Right now, the fuel
Oh, you can get down to Geelong, no trouble at all. No, you don't read. Exactly right. So now he's starting to turn east and heading towards Melbourne. Very gentle indeed. In fact, this aeroplane you can only fly in weather that's very calm, 6 to 8 knots, and any higher than that you wouldn't be able to go.
If it runs into bad weather, with the visuals available, what have you got?
Well, you don't take off in bad weather. In fact, the students, the ordinary officer of the day go out with his white hanging in, if it flooded a bit in the air, then they wouldn't go. That's how calm needed to be. So he's now turned south and gradually heading towards the base, ready for his coming to land. That's a new complex down the Point Cook Road there actually. It's called the Olive, which is a new resort. No, I don't. And you can see the runway coming into view where he took off from. I wouldn't be showing this if I wouldn't be showing this if it was a mess at the end. So he's come down in height and getting ready to touch the ground. Power's come off, so he's virtually gliding in. There you go. So that's a circuit in a Boxkite, and as I said before, that's roughly what the students would be experiencing. If they did that on another occasion, and they did figure eights in the aeroplane in terms of then really that would qualify them for their wings. Because they can fly.